Political and economic friction in Europe is rising, and not just from the first round of the French presidential election, where Marine Le Pen's anti-immigration National Front won almost 1 in 5 votes. In Holland, a country that's no Greece, indeed is one of the few EU members with a AAA rating, the Dutch government collapsed, caught up in the maelstrom of popular opposition to the German-inspired European Union austerity package. Austerity measures have also been blamed for Britain's slump back into recession this week, though of course it's not tied to the euro. Europe's crisis is deepening. Welcome to Agenda with George Friedman. George, the upcoming final round of the French elections is key here. Both the incumbent Nicolas Sarkozy and his challenger, the socialist François Hollande, are competing for those who voted for Le Pen on a platform of abandoning the euro and returning to the franc. What's your analysis of the significance of that vote?
Well, obviously, Sarkozy is a politician. He will try to tack in such a way as to win the election. But the really important thing is that the National Front emerges as the kingmaker. You have a virtual tie, a near tie between the two leading parties, and a right-wing group, a far right-wing group, pulling almost 20% of the vote. I mean, what we're seeing here is a fundamental crisis in Europe evolving. Yes, the National Front has done well in previous elections. It's not the first one. But it means something different in this one. There is a crisis in Europe, a twin crisis. The first part of the crisis is a crisis concerning the European Union. The question of whether or not it's viable, whether it's a good idea, whether it serves the interests of people. It's interpreted in different ways in different countries, differently in Germany and differently in Greece, obviously. But there's a universal questioning of Europe. What used to be a marginal issue, Euroscepticism, has now become much more powerful after the crisis. You also have, attached to this, the issue of immigration and borders. There is obviously anti-Islamic feeling in Europe. There's concern about immigration. And above all, in the end, there's a concern about the fact that countries have lost control of their borders. That's what Le Pen capitalized on. The elite is divided, and therefore the more marginal party with some strength now starts to decide things. Now, what happens in the rest of Europe? As elections come, will other right-wing parties emerge? Will other Eurosceptic parties, anti-immigration parties, come together and start defining the system? I suspect it will. I suspect that this is more than just a French phenomenon. I think it's going to be a broader phenomenon, which the elite parties are simply not trusted to be taking care of the need of the other 99%, as it's called, and you're going to be seeing shifts, sometimes left-wing parties, but more often right-wing parties because they touch the anti-immigration tone.
Along with immigration, we also have another issue, austerity, an issue that's brought the Dutch government down and is highly divisive.
Austerity is always unpopular. By definition, it means that some people will get less than others. It also breeds questions about what made austerity necessary. And in this case, the explanation is twofold. They'll make the case that austerity was caused by the irresponsibility of the financial elite, who has behaved very irresponsibly over the past years and now transfers the consequences to the middle class and the poor. The other is that the European Union as an institution, including the central bank, the Brussels bureaucracy, and so on, has behaved in such a way as to protect the interests of the elite and not necessarily the interests of the mass. And so the austerity measures, which would always bring hostility, are particularly biting because the classes that are suffering from it don't feel responsible for what happened. The elites may argue it was excessive social spending or other things that benefited them. That may well be contributing to this, but you really have a crisis of the elite. You really have the view that the elite, having fumbled very badly, and sometimes mendaciously, shifted the responsibility to the masses, and that's going to have political consequences, as it has in France and other places. So you have an underlying unease about what Europe is becoming. And then you add to it that, for various reasons, many European countries are slipping into recession. And that causes a crisis that's not just economic, but psychological. There has been a belief that the European Union as an institution will, over the long term, assure prosperity, and that the continental model is inherently superior to the Anglo-Saxon model and the Americans. Well, the British may have problems. The Americans are growing modestly, and the Europeans are slipping. And so there's a question about this entire project of Europe. What is it worth? Was valuable. It may not be a coherent argument. It may not be well-reasoned. It may not even be correct in the end. But it is politically potent, and it's going to have effects in a lot of countries, not just in Holland, but in what's going on in Hungary and the politics of the Hungarians at this point, a range of problems that are going to really create crisis, I think, politically in a great deal of Europe.
And of course, the people who feel strongly about austerity also lay some blame on the other issue, migration and border control, because migrants compete for jobs. Hollande in France, for example, has argued this.
Well, I mean, this is really a question not just of migration, but of sovereignty. One of the issues that has been raised in Europe is whether or not this transnational concept is benefiting the countries. There's a sense that the Europeans have lost control of their own fate, that it's in the hands of bankers, it's in the hands of Germans, whoever. The immigration issue is certainly an important issue, but along with that is a sovereignty issue. Who controls the borders of France? Who controls the borders of Hungary? Who controls who comes in and who goes out? The European Union would say that, look, I mean, it doesn't matter who controls them. I mean, we have open borders. And that's precisely the issue that's at stake here. Are open borders beneficial? And you're going to see the left raising this question because of their working class constituencies, as well as the right raising it in different ways. And caught in the center is going to be some of the traditional parties that really are committed to Europe, committed to immigration, committed to whatever needs to be done to save the European Union, and that brings us to crisis.
There are strong forces who want the European project to succeed, though. I was lucky enough to be invited to lunch with a former Polish president a couple of weeks ago who, though critical of some aspects of the European leadership, believed the EU had to stand together, in particular to prevent the rising Asia-Pacific region from taking advantage of Europe's weaknesses.
Well, I don't think the Asian-Pacific region is the challenge to Europe. Europe is the challenge to Europe, and it's very easy to say stand together, but on what principles will you stand? I mean, there is a fundamental difference between the German view of what Europe ought to mean and now, let's say, the Spanish view. There's also a fundamental difference between the elite's view, the financial elite, the media elite, the political elite, and increasing mass dissatisfaction with this. And as for people taking advantage of the situation, the Asians are the least interesting. It will be the Russians and the Americans, both of which are doing substantially better than Europe politically. They're united. They're growing, neither of which are robust, but certainly they are in a position to take advantage of the European weakness if they choose.
George Friedman, ending this week's agenda. Thanks for being with us at Stratfor today.